Her red dress sparkled under the shiny ceiling light, but her eyes were full of tears. The billionaire's daughter, who had laughed at the maid just hours earlier, now lowered her head in shame. "I was wrong. Mama, I was wrong about her," she whispered, her voice breaking. The maid, a kind woman with tired eyes and gray streaks in her hair, stepped forward. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She just placed her hand gently on the girl's cheek. That one touch, filled with love and forgiveness, silenced a room full of billionaires and multimillionaires. Before we dive into the story, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from and hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories. Now, let's get into the story. The quiet hum in the kitchen of Naomi and Elias Hawthorne's sprawling, polished home was a sound of pure, nervous effort. It was the night of the biggest dinner party of the year, a night where business deals worth millions were often decided over butter knives and imported wine. And at the heart of all that pressure was Grace. Grace wasn't just a maid. She was the engine room, the quiet commander of the Hawthorne household. For 10 years, she'd been their rock, their confidant, and, tonight, the sole chef tasked with creating a meal worthy of the tycoons and moguls gathering in the dining room. She was a woman built for motion, graceful and sturdy, with hands that looked like they belonged to an artist. Those hands, today, were working magic, folding delicate phyllo pastry over spiced lamb, and whisking a sweet potato and ginger puree that smelled like sunshine and Christmas all at once. Grace was in her late 40s, her skin the color of rich earth, and her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, secured by a simple black clip. She wore her uniform, crisp and clean, with a quiet dignity that no silk dress in the house could match. The truth was, Grace poured her whole life into her cooking. It wasn't just fuel, it was love, ancestry, and a silent language she spoke better than any other. She was raised in Portmore, Jamaica, and though she now worked in a high-end estate near Toronto, Canada, her food carried the soul of the island, refined and elevated for this world of wealth. She was proud. She was always proud of the food she made. She knew the guests. She knew how they talked. Not about her, usually, but about things. About money, about status, about how their lives were somehow better than everyone else's. In the dining room, the atmosphere was already thick with expensive cologne and louder-than-necessary laughter. Elias Hawthorne, a man whose spreadsheets were as famous as his impeccably tailored suits, greeted his guests with a professional warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elias was tall, silver-haired, and preoccupied. He needed this dinner to go perfectly. But it was Naomi Hawthorne, Elias's wife, who gave Grace the strength to keep moving. Naomi, with her warm, genuine smile and easy elegance, treated Grace like family. Just an hour ago, she'd slipped into the kitchen. "Grace, my dear," Naomi had whispered, adjusting a place setting she wasn't even holding. She was beautiful, dressed in deep sapphire blue, but her eyes were kind. "That aroma is heaven. Don't you worry about Travis Staling. He's the only one who matters for Elias tonight, but is also just a fussy old bear. Cook with your heart, like you always do. That's all that matters." Naomi's words were a balm, but they also confirmed the pressure. Travis Sterling. The name itself felt stiff. He was a British real estate mogul visiting from the UK, known for his relentless critiques and his extremely traditional, old-school taste. Everything had to be just so, and if it wasn't, he wouldn't hesitate to say so, loudly. Grace had heard that Mr. Sterling once sent back a $500 bottle of wine because the label was crooked. He was thin, with a perpetually dissatisfied expression that looked like he was constantly smelling something sour. She took a deep breath, focusing on the first course, an elegant presentation of slow-roasted root vegetables, beets, carrots, and parsnips, finished with a tamarind glaze, served over a bed of creamy, subtle coconut risotto. It was a perfect blend of comfort and gourmet. As she plated the food, she heard the kitchen door swing open quietly. It was Leah, a young housekeeper from Trinidad who was helping with the service. Leah looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with a silver serving tray. "Grace," Leah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just took the amuse-bouch out." Mr. Sterling. He took one look and asked the waiter if the kitchen had forgotten the main flavorings of Europe. Grace's hands stilled, hovering over the creamy risotto. The knot tightened further. Forgotten the main flavorings. That was the code. It was the subtle, cutting way people like that dismissed anything that didn't look like their grandmother's white bread and butter. It was a rejection not of the food, but of the culture and the person who created it. Did he eat it? Grace asked, her voice low and steady, revealing none of the sudden chill running down her spine. Leah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. He pushed it aside and told the waiter to bring the dinner rolls early. Then Mrs. Caldwell, the lady in the red dress, just smiled a sharp little smile and didn't touch Hayes either. This wasn't about missing a spice. This was deliberate. This was about making a quiet statement about what was considered acceptable at a table like this. Grace finished plating the first 6 bowls, each one a miniature work of art. She handed the heavy tray to Leah. Tell them this is the tamarind sunset risotto. Describe it clearly. Tell them it's seasonal and fresh. And smile, dear. Never let them see the worry. Leah nodded and slipped back out, the swing door whispering shut behind her. Grace stood alone, the smells of the main course, her famous jerk-spiced Cornish hens, filling the air, but suddenly feeling heavy. She leaned against the cool stainless steel counter for a moment, closing her eyes. She pictured her grandmother back in Jamaica, teaching her to grate nutmeg, telling her that good food was the easiest way to send a blessing out into the world. Grace had put nothing but blessings into this dinner. She listened intently. A few moments later, she heard the faint, muffled sound of glassware and cutlery from the dining room. She heard the low murmur of conversation, but nothing sharp or distinct. Then, the swing door burst open again. It was Devon, the lead server, his face pale and tight. He was holding the tray of 6 untouched risotto bowls. The beautiful, creamy rice, the glazed vegetables, all still there. Grace, he said, his voice strained. They barely touched it. Mr. Sterling said something about the dish being too ambitious for its origins. 2 other couples then politely sent theirs back too, saying they were saving space for the main course. Grace stayed at the plates. The sheer waste of the love, the time, the ingredients, it hit her like a physical blow. The unspoken message was loud and clear. We don't want to eat food made by you. She swallowed hard, her heart aching. But as she looked down at the main course she was preparing, the golden, fragrant, perfectly roasted jerk hens resting on a bed of sweet mango salsa, a wave of quiet defiance washed over her. She had spent 3 days perfecting this meal. She had sourced the best ingredients from farmers markets in upstate New York, spent hours marinating, basting, and checking the temperature. The food was beautiful, it was complex, and it was good. No snide comment or dismissive gesture from a man who measures his worth by his bank account could take that truth away from her. She was a professional, and she would act like one. She picked up the brush and began to apply one last, shimmering glaze to the hens. Her expression hardened slightly, not with anger, but with an inner resolve. She would present this main course. She would present her art, and she would do it with her head held high. Hope wasn't about the guests liking the food. Hope was about her knowing the truth of the effort, the love, and the culture she was sharing. With a new, quiet determination settling in her chest, Grace carefully lifted the heavy roasting pan. She knew the moment of truth was coming. Her pride, her skill, and her heart were all laid bare on that platter. The dinner might be ruined by snobbery, but her self-respect, that was still perfectly intact. The silver serving carts rolled silently into the enormous dining room, their wheels muffled by the thick Persian rug. Everything about the Hawthorns' dinner was designed to project quiet, assured wealth. But tonight, that quiet was about to be broken. Grace followed the carts, holding a final, small dish of roasted plantains meant as an accompaniment. The jerk-spiced Cornish hens were a sight, glossy, golden brown, and fragrant with pimento, thyme, and the rich smoke from the kitchen oven. The aroma was immediately distinct, a warm, bright wave that cut through the stuffy silence of the room. The guests paused their conversations. For a brief moment, even the perpetually sour-faced Trevor Sterling stopped swirling his cognac and looked up. The presentation was flawless. The servers, led by Devon, expertly placed the dishes down, the jerk hens resting beside a vibrant sweet mango salsa and that puree of ginger and sweet potato Grace had worried over. The plates hit the table with a soft clink, and for a moment, hope flared in Grace's chest. Maybe, just maybe, they would judge the plate on its flavor, not its background. It was Mrs. Caldwell, the lady in the red dress from Chapter 1, who spoke first. She was a woman who spoke less in conversations and more in calculated observations. She picked up her fork, hesitated, and then put it down again. My, she said, her voice lilting and thin, aim more at the table than the server. The aroma is certainly bold. One almost needs a passport. Devon, dear, who exactly is the culinary artist behind this, creative menu? Devon, bless his heart, answered honestly and with a touch of pride. He looked toward the kitchen door where Grace was standing, just out of the main spotlight. That would be Grace, Mrs. Caldwell. She is the Hawthorne's executive household manager and personal chef. She's responsible for everything you see tonight. Grace heard the word executive and smiled internally. Elias and Naomi had fought for her to have that title, to match the scope of her work. But Mr. Trevor Sterling wasn't interested in job titles. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Devon, his tone dropping several degrees. By personal chef, you mean the hired help, the usual staff? Sterling didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Elias, the host. Elias, I must admit, I rather assumed for a dinner of this magnitude, you would have employed a proper catering firm. Perhaps someone established in London or New York. I hear Chef Du Bois is available. Elias Hawthorne, sensing the immediate shift in temperature, cleared his throat and tried to smooth the awkwardness with a little too much enthusiasm. Nonsense, Trevor. Grace is better than any firm. She has been with us for a decade. She prepares all our important meals. She's Jamaican, you know, and brings that wonderful passion to everything she makes. This jerk hen is a famous recipe of hers. Elias meant well, truly, but the words hung in the air like a fog, confirming everything the snobs needed to hear. The food was made by the help. The food was foreign. The moment Elias said, she's Jamaican, the atmosphere of the room curdled. It didn't take a shouted insult. It was far more cutting than that. Mr. Sterling exchanged a look with Mrs. Caldwell. It was a swift, silent exchange of raised eyebrows and tiny, almost invisible downtones of the mouth. It said, I knew it. It said, how provincial. Then came the murmurs. Oh, a home recipe. A guest named Martin whispered loudly enough for the whole table to hear. Martin was a lumber baron from Vancouver, a man whose clothes cost more than most people's yearly salaries. That explains the heat. A bit too aggressive for a digestive system that's been raised on mild sauces. Wouldn't you agree, darling? He asked his wife. His wife, Bethany, a woman draped in diamonds, patted his hand and looked at the plate with a forced, dainty grimace. Well, I certainly don't want to risk any excitement before the contract is signed, Martin. Best stick to the bread, perhaps. Mrs. Caldwell leaned toward the woman next to her and murmured, a sound like silk ripping. It's sweet of Naomi to be so supportive of her staff, but there's a place for kitchen specialties, and it isn't a state dinner. Honestly, who hosts a dinner like this without a proper white-glove caterer? Grace, standing near the serving station, heard every single whisper, every loaded glance. They weren't judging the food. They were judging her. They were judging the color of her skin and the rhythm of the place she came from. The knot in her stomach was a cold, hard stone now. She felt the heat rising on her face, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She had watched her grandmother handle far worse situations with a straight back and a simple truth. If you know your worth, no one can steal it. Grace kept her eyes straight ahead, focused on instructing Devon on how to serve the accompanying side dishes. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, professional, and entirely steady. Devon, ensure the salsa is placed on the left, please. It balances the spice. Serve from the left. Thank you. It was a small, quiet act of resistance. She was performing her job flawlessly under fire. She was refusing to dissolve into the stereotype they were trying to paint. The emotional, easily flustered help. She was simply the most dignified person in that expensive, arrogant room. Naomi caught Grace's eye across the table. Naomi's usual warm smile was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, burning embarrassment. Not for Grace, but for her guests. Naomi gave a subtle shake of her head, a gesture of apology and solidarity that only Grace would understand. But Elias, the billionaire host, was looking at the plates, then at Sterling, then at the massive business deal hanging in the balance. He was panicking. Grace watched as Mr. Sterling picked up his fork, poked the fragrant hen, sniffed theatrically, and then set the fork down, never having taken a bite. "I think," Sterling announced, loud enough to stop all conversation, "I shall follow Bethany's lead. Save space for the dessert, which I trust will be more traditionally prepared." Within minutes, 3 other plates were pushed away, barely touched. The beautiful, love-filled food was rejected. Grace finally gave Devon the signal and retreated to the kitchen, leaving the silent judgment hanging in the air. The moment she stepped through the door, away from the glittering, cruel eyes, the dignified armor she had worn started to crack. A wave of exhaustion and pain washed over her. She walked to the pantry and leaned her head against the cool wood, tears threatening to spill. They didn't even taste it, she thought. They judged the cook, not the cooking. The humiliation was sharp, burning right through her professional control. But then, Grace straightened up. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. In the pantry, she saw her grandmother's old, wooden spice box she kept tucked away, a simple, chipped relic in this vast, modern kitchen. She opened the lid, and the scent of fresh nutmeg, cinnamon, and allspice filled the air. She inhaled deeply. These were the true, good flavors of her life, the heritage she carried. She hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't failed. Her food was excellent. Their hearts were just small. Grace looked at the clock. Dessert was next. She had a choice. Let their arrogance shrink her, or let her dignity stand tall. She closed the spice box with a decisive click. She chose her dignity. She knew that sometimes justice wasn't loud. It was simply standing firm in your own truth. Hope and love were still there, tucked right inside that spice box, ready for the next act. The main course, Grace's golden, spiced Cornish hens, sat steaming on the table, a beacon of warmth and flavor in a room that was suddenly freezing. All the quiet tension of the appetizers was now coiled tight, ready to snap. Trevor Sterling was the executioner. He hadn't touched his fork. He hadn't even unfolded his napkin fully. His eyes, small and cold, were fixed on the plate, but he wasn't seeing food. He was seeing a political statement he didn't approve of. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his impeccable white shirt. The movement was slow, deliberate, and designed to capture the attention of the entire room. "Elias," Sterling said, his voice flat and cutting, louder than any whisper. "I truly apologize, but I simply cannot proceed with this. My stomach, you see, is terribly sensitive to surprises." Elias Hawthorne, who had been nervously tracing the rim of his wine glass, looked up, his face pale. He understood the stakes. This was no longer about a meal. It was about respect, or the lack thereof, in a room where every slight meant something. "Trevor, come now," Elias tried, forcing a small, strained chuckle. "It's delicious, I assure you. Just a little spice. Grace uses the freshest ingredients." Sterling held up a hand, stopping Elias mid-sentence, a bold, dismissive gesture to his host. "With all due respect, Elias, delicious is a subjective term, isn't it? When one operates on a global scale, one must maintain certain standards of sophistication. We're discussing a multi-million-dollar venture tonight, and frankly, I prefer my business dealings and my palate to remain grounded in something far more traditionally established than this. I'm afraid I'll have to skip this course entirely." He gave the plate a final, contemptuous glance, then slid it a full foot away from his setting. It was a rejection so absolute, it felt like a gunshot in the silent room. Martin, the lumber baron from Vancouver, jumped on the opportunity immediately. He looked across the table at Sterling, nodding eagerly. Quite right, Trevor. Standards. Yes, that's exactly it. Martin, too, finds this dish taxing on the eye. My deepest apologies, Naomi, Martin said, directing his false sympathy to the hostess. He then pushed his own plate away with a loud, theatrical scraping sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Too much adventure for an evening like this. Then came Mrs. Caldwell, who merely offered a tight, condescending smile. I'm with a gentleman. Saving room for dessert? Of course. That will be something French, won't it? Something reliable. The wave of refusal spread quickly. It was a domino effect of snobbery. Plates slid forward, cutlery was abandoned, and expensive wine remained untouched. Within 90 seconds, half the table had rejected Grace's hard work, all based on a few cutting words about standards and origins. An oppressive, agonizing silence crashed down on the room. The only sounds were the quiet, frantic breathing of the servers and the distant, muffled sound of traffic outside. Every eye was now fixed on the remaining plates. And then, almost simultaneously, they turned toward Grace, who was still standing by the kitchen door. Grace felt the humiliation not as a hot flush, but as an internal pressure, like every cell in her body was trying to shrink away. Yet, she stood her ground. Her back was straight, her chin was level, and her expression was carefully neutral. She was the professional. She was waiting for her host and hostess to direct her next move. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Elias, her employer, the billionaire, was utterly defeated. His big business deal was collapsing, and he knew it. He didn't look at Grace. He looked at his wife, Naomi, with a silent plea for help. Naomi, however, was not looking at Elias. She was looking at Grace, and then she looked at Trevor Sterling. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She watched as her husband floundered, unable to salvage the evening without sacrificing his dignity or sacrificing Grace. Finally, Sterling, wanting to deliver the final blow, turned his cold gaze directly to Grace. Maid, he called out, the word stinging and intentional, stripping away any pretense of titles like chef or manager. Tell us, you do confirm that this is precisely the dish you intended to serve to us. No substitutions, no last-minute, safer options. The question was a direct challenge. It forced Grace to acknowledge the rejection, to confirm her own inferior creation. Grace took a slow, deep breath, her eyes meeting Sterling's, holding his gaze with a composure he clearly hadn't expected. Sir, she replied, her voice low and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried immense weight. I can confirm that the dish served is the jerk spice Cornish hen with tamarind mango salsa, as prepared by me. It is exactly as intended. Her simple, dignified confirmation was another quiet act of resistance. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply stated the truth of her work. Sterling sneered, satisfied with her acknowledgement of a staff status. I see. Well, that concludes the matter. The silence returned, heavier and more painful than before. Grace stood there for another moment, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, absorbing the raw shame that the guests were so eager to dish out. But as she finally prepared to turn and retreat, a single set of eyes stopped her. Naomi Hawthorne. Naomi had been frozen in her seat, watching the cruelty unfold. Now, she looked past the glittering silverware and the arrogant faces of her guests, and her eyes met Grace's. In that moment, a powerful, unspoken conversation passed between the two women. Grace saw the deep, genuine sorrow in Naomi's eyes, followed quickly by a flicker of something fierce, a protective, decisive fire that promised retribution. It was a look that said, I see what they did. And this is not over. Grace felt a small, powerful lift in her chest. She wasn't standing alone against this wave of snobbery. She retreated into the kitchen, the rejection still stinging, but the look from Naomi had already planted the seed of a powerful hope. Justice and loyalty, she realized, were far stronger ingredients than any snob's standards. The fight might have been lost, but the real victory was about to begin. The silence that fell after Grace's dignified retreat was worse than any angry shouting. It was a dense, suffocating silence, heavy with the weight of insult. Trevor Sterling was leaning back, a satisfied, cold smirk playing on his lips, convinced he had won the evening. Elias Hawthorne looked like a man watching his life savings burn. But then, Naomi Hawthorne, the woman in the sapphire dress, moved. She moved slowly, deliberately, lifting her napkin from her lap and placing it neatly beside her plate, a plate that still held the golden, fragrant Cornish hen. She looked down the long, shimmering table at her guests. Her eyes, usually so warm and welcoming, were now glacial blue, entirely devoid of mercy. Naomi had watched the entire performance. She had seen the way they looked at Grace. She had heard the venom in Sterling's voice and the false piety in Mrs. Caldwell's murmurs. The humiliation Grace endured was a betrayal of everything Naomi held dear. She waited until the servers, nervous and trembling, were completely gone, the swing doors shutting softly behind them. Then, she spoke. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. It was a quiet sound that somehow filled the entire cavernous dining room, demanding attention more effectively than a scream. "Well," Naomi began, her voice a smooth ribbon of silk, but with a sharp edge underneath. "It seems we have reached a consensus. Some of you, as Mr. Sterling so eloquently put it, are more concerned with maintaining standards than with actual quality." She paused, letting the word standards hang in the air, allowing the shocked, nervous faces of the guests to register. Sterling's smirk wavered. "Elias and I hosted this dinner to discuss important business." "Yes," Naomi continued, her gaze sweeping across the table, not missing a single person who had rejected the food. "But more importantly, we hosted it to share a meal made with love, tradition, and skill. A meal that is undeniably exceptional." She then turned her focus directly onto Trevor Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, you speak of standards and sophistication," Naomi stated, her tone still perfectly modulated, almost conversational. "But I must confess, I find your actions tonight deeply confusing. You claim to represent the pinnacle of culture, yet you dismiss a dish based purely on the assumed status of the person who cooked it, without even tasting it." Sterling stammered, his composure finally cracking. "Naomi, I assure you, it's nothing personal. Simply a preference for classical cuisine over kitchen specialties." "Kitchen specialties." Naomi's voice rose just enough to show the cutting disdain in her heart. "The man you praised earlier, Chef Du Bois, runs a billion-dollar catering business on the same principle, taking the cuisine of his heritage and elevating it. But when Grace does it, it is a specialty, is it? When the chef is someone you assume has no right to talent or artistry, the food suddenly becomes too ambitious for its origins. That is not a standard, Mr. Sterling. That is hypocrisy." The word landed like a small, heavy stone. The air was thick with shock. Elias stared at his wife, stunned into utter silence. The other guests looked anywhere but at Naomi. Naomi took a slow sip of water, allowing the weight of her accusation to sink in. "You see, the difference between Grace and the caterers you would prefer is simple," she continued. "Grace puts her entire heart into the food. She is honest, she is brilliant, and she is loyal. She is a true artist. You look at her, and you see the maid. Elias and I look at her, and we see family." She looked pointedly at Martin, who was fiddling with his collar, and at Mrs. Caldwell, whose cheeks were now blotchy with suppressed anger. "For many years, this table has been a place of high integrity and real dealing," Naomi said, her voice now laced with fierce disappointment. "And tonight, you have shown up and displayed nothing but shallow prejudice. You have judged a woman's skill by the color of her skin and the label you have assigned her. That, my friends, is not the standard of sophistication. It is the standard of smallness." She gestured toward the plates. "You are afraid of flavor, afraid of culture, and most disappointingly, you are afraid of true quality that doesn't come with a white glove price tag attached to the chef's name. You reject a perfectly prepared meal because it challenges your narrow, outdated perception of who is worthy of art." The guests were completely silenced. Their initial arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by the crushing humiliation of being called out by their wealthy hostess in front of their peers. Naomi then turned to Elias, her expression softening slightly, a silent demand for his backbone to show up. He understood. He finally understood that the value of his wife and his loyalty was worth more than Sterling's contract. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Devon," Naomi called out clearly, addressing the stunned server. "Please come and clear the plates of the guests who have finished dinner." That would be Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Caldwell, Martin, and Bethany. The command was absolute. It was a polite dismissal. "And Devon," she added, her voice regaining a final, warm strength. "The guests who still have their food, the truly sophisticated ones, I might add, will enjoy their dinner in peace. The evening, for them, continues." As the servers carefully began clearing the 4 rejected plates, leaving the others untouched, the hypocrisy was physically removed from the table. Sterling sputtered, finally finding his voice, but it was weak. "Naomi, this is outrageous. You are risking business for a point." Naomi simply fixed him with a cold stare. "No, Mr. Sterling. I am setting a new standard for this table, and it is a standard of respect." In the kitchen, Grace was still leaning against the pantry door, her quiet dignity just beginning to fray. But then, the door swung open slightly, and Devon rushed in, his eyes wide. "Grace," he whispered, his face alight with awe. "You should have heard Mrs. Hawthorne. She laid into them. She called them out for their prejudice and their hypocrisy. She told them they were small. She made them clear their plates and basically told them to leave." Grace slowly pushed off the wall. The humiliation was instantly lifted, replaced by a rush of warmth so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't seen it, but she felt it, a fierce, protective justice radiating from the dining room. Love and loyalty had won. The kindness Naomi had shown her was the greatest ingredient of all. Grace took a deep breath, her heart full, knowing that in that moment, she was the truly respected, true victor of the entire night. The moment after Naomi finished speaking, the dining room became a landscape of ruined arrogance. Trevor Sterling and Mrs. Caldwell rose from the table, not with their previous hauteur, but with the tight, jerky movements of people who have been publicly shamed. They didn't even attempt a polite farewell. They simply grabbed their belongings and made for the front hall. Elias Hawthorne, still stunned by his wife's powerful defense, followed them silently. He stood tall, blocking the possibility of any further snide comments. He had hesitated when it mattered most, but now he was fully on Naomi's side, a wall of quiet support. Naomi remained at the table, her composure unwavering, watching the defeated party retreat. Justice felt cold, yes, but undeniably right. The air was tense, but the love and loyalty she felt for Grace was a warmth against the chill. It was into this fragile, charged atmosphere that Chloe Hawthorne arrived. Chloe, their 20-year-old daughter, walked in from the foyer, talking brightly into her phone, completely oblivious to the war that had just been fought. She was dressed in an impossibly expensive, casual outfit, her movements radiating the effortless entitlement of someone who has never been told no for anything important. "Oh, hi everyone. Are you leaving already?" she chirped, lowering her phone as she saw the procession of disgruntled guests heading for the front door, led by a furiously silent Sterling. Sterling, seizing the final chance for validation, stopped just short of the door. "Yes, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It seems your mother has taken a sudden, rather dramatic moral stand tonight. A stand that, frankly, is quite confusing to those of us who appreciate consistency." Chloe, whose heroes were often people with bank accounts as big as Sterling's, immediately bristled, rushing to the defense of her social clique. She looked at her mother, who was still standing by the table, radiating steel. "Mom, what is going on? Mr. Sterling, is this about the food? I told Dad not to let Grace cook for big events," Chloe said, her voice rising in irritation. She was trying to fit in with the departing guests, to show them she was one of them, not one of the moral stand-takers. Naomi watched her daughter with a deep, aching disappointment that superseded all the anger she felt for the guests. Chloe, that is enough, Naomi said, her voice firm and low. But Chloe had already committed to the arrogance of her peers. She turned and gestured emphatically toward the kitchen door. No, it's not enough. Seriously, Mom, the jerk chicken, for a corporate deal with Trevor Sterling? Come on, it's always some weird, overly spiced thing. I don't understand why she's even here. She's loud, she's always in the way, and honestly, I don't even like her. Chloe crossed her arms, petulant and entitled. I think the guests were right to refuse the food. She's just a maid, after all. Why are you risking a business deal for her? The word "she's just a maid" hit the quiet room like a physical blow, worse than anything Sterling had said. It was a cold, familial betrayal. Sterling actually cracked a genuine smile of vindication. Elias, who had been listening silently, finally snapped out of his shock. He took 2 firm strides to stand beside Naomi, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Naomi didn't need his support to speak, but she appreciated the gesture. She focused her entire attention on Chloe. Her voice, though quiet, was so intense it forced everyone, Sterling, Caldwell, and even the waiting valet, to listen. Chloe, Naomi said, her eyes boring into her daughter's. You will never, ever use that tone or those words in this house again. Do you understand me? Chloe stumbled over a defensive reply. But Mom, it's true. She's staff. She's paid to be here. And Naomi cut her off, not by shouting, but by speaking with the quiet, devastating force of truth. Grace is not just a maid. Chloe, Grace is a magnificent cook, a deeply kind woman, and she is a valued part of this family. She has been more loyal to us than almost anyone at this table tonight. And you, Naomi's voice cracked slightly with the pain of the betrayal. You have just shown yourself to be exactly the kind of small-minded, prejudiced person I hoped you would never become. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You risk nothing by offending Mr. Sterling. Elias can handle the business consequences, but you risk your soul by offending Grace. You risk your character by believing that status and money are the only things that matter. Grace's worth is not defined by her paycheck, it is defined by her integrity. That is a standard you will never achieve if you look down on people who work with their hands and their hearts. Naomi's words weren't a reprimand. They were a surgical strike against Chloe's arrogance. They were the moral law of the house, delivered with finality. Elias then stepped forward, his expression equally serious. Your mother is right, Chloe. We are Hawthorns. We don't sacrifice good people for bad money. The guests leaving tonight showed us exactly who they are. Do not follow their example. The combined weight of her parents' moral authority crushed Chloe's resistance instantly. Her face went from petulance to stunned shame. She finally saw the true scale of what she had done and the finality of the value she had crossed. Trevor Sterling, seeing his last gasp of dignity utterly defeated by a family united in moral strength, sneered one last time, muttered something about poor taste, and stalked out, followed quickly by the rest of his embarrassed group. In the kitchen, Grace was still standing, trembling slightly, but now she was smiling. She had heard the commotion, the sudden, loud outburst from Chloe, the firm, protective tone of Naomi, and the deep, resonating backing from Elias. She hadn't heard every word, but she heard the cadence of defense, the rhythm of protection. It wasn't the food that mattered anymore. It was the love. Grace walked over to the counter and picked up a clean dish towel. She knew her job was safe, but more importantly, she knew her dignity was not only restored but fiercely protected by the people who mattered most. The whole evening, which had started with a sting of humiliation, ended with the warming, undeniable comfort of knowing that in the Hawthorne house, the heart and the character of a loyal woman meant more than any billionaire's standard. Hope had prevailed, delivered by a mother's fierce love for what was right. The vast kitchen, usually a humming center of activity, was now eerily quiet. The drama had retreated, leaving behind the heavy silence and the lingering aroma of jerk spice and regret. Grace stood by the sink, slowly wiping down the stainless steel counter where she had plated the rejected hens. She was tired, but the exhaustion was different now. It wasn't the bone-deep weariness of a servant whose pride has been crushed. It was the satisfied fatigue of a soldier who has won a difficult, necessary battle. She had heard the fierce cadence of Naomi's voice, and she had felt the shockwave of righteous justice ripple through the house. Why do they care so much? It was a question Grace hadn't asked herself in years, because somewhere along the way, she had simply accepted that she was family. But tonight, with the sting of Chloe's cruel words about her being just the maid still echoing faintly, Grace had to remember the origins of that powerful, protective love. Her eyes fell on a small, worn wooden block nestled discreetly on a high shelf, a simple, hand-painted growth chart from years ago. The memory flowed over her like warm water, pulling her back 10 years, long before this polished estate, long before Elias Hawthorne was a billionaire. She was back in the little, slightly run-down starter home in upstate New York, where Elias was a young, frenetic businessman consumed by building his first major company. Naomi was a struggling new mother, overwhelmed and often tearful. Grace had been hired as the live-in nanny and cook. It wasn't money they needed then, Grace murmured to herself, polishing a water glass until it gleamed. It was anchors. She remembered little Chloe, the same sharp-tongued young woman who had just called her staff, as a tiny, colicky baby who would only sleep when Grace sang her low, soft Jamaican lullabies. Grace was the one who taught Chloe to walk, to share, and to say please. She spent her evenings reading storybooks to Chloe and her younger brother, Leo, tucked up in a modest room, smelling faintly of the rice and peas she had cooked for dinner. Grace's love for those children was not hired, it was simply given. But the true foundation of Naomi's loyalty was forged in a crisis no one outside the family knew about. Elias was on a pivotal business trip in Asia, a high-stakes, 3-week marathon that would make or break his company. 2 days into his trip, Naomi fell desperately ill. It wasn't just a flu. It was a sudden, debilitating infection that sent her to the hospital for weeks. She was frightened, alone, and completely overwhelmed by the thought of being separated from her babies. Grace didn't hesitate. She didn't just handle the house. She became the core of the Hawthorne family unit. She stayed at the hospital during visiting hours, holding Naomi's hand when the doctors gave uncertain diagnoses. "Don't you worry, Miss Naomi," Grace remembered saying, squeezing the pale, trembling hand of her employer. "You worry about getting strong. I am here. Your children are loved and safe. I'm making them soup and singing their songs. Just come home to us." Grace would rush back from the hospital to cook, clean, and manage 2 terrified toddlers, keeping a semblance of normal life for them. She handled the panic calls from Elias, never once complaining or asking for more pay, simply offering him calm, factual reports and assuring him Naomi was fighting hard. When Naomi finally came home, weak and recovering, it wasn't Elias who was waiting with the first hot meal. It was Grace. She spoon-fed Naomi broth and sat with her late into the night, listening to her deepest fears about failing as a mother and a wife. Grace was the only one who saw the fragility behind Naomi's elegant composure. One evening, Naomi was crying, feeling useless and defeated. "I don't know how I can ever repay you, Grace," Naomi had choked out, tears staining her pillow. "You saved my children. You saved me." Grace simply held her hand and smiled with that quiet, deep dignity that was her signature. "We are safe, Miss Naomi. That is payment enough. We are a team here. You rest now." When Elias finally returned, exhausted but triumphant from his business trip, he walked into a home that was intact, not because of his money, but because of Grace. He saw the bond between his wife and Grace, a bond of survival and shared struggle. He understood then that the woman who cooked his food and raised his children was a cornerstone of his success, not a replaceable staff member. It was Elias who, shortly after that crisis, raised his salary and gave her the title of executive household manager, making a silent vow to Naomi that Grace would always be protected in their home. Grace's eyes drifted from the growth chart to the sparkling copper pots hanging over the stove. The vast wealth they now possessed could never buy the loyalty and fierce love that had been tested and proven 10 years ago. This was why Naomi didn't hesitate to sacrifice a business deal for Grace's dignity. The defense tonight wasn't a sudden stand. It was the payoff of a decade-old debt of the heart. A sound behind her made her turn. It was Naomi. She was wearing a simple silk robe now, her sapphire dress gone, her face tied but alight with a soft, residual fierce pride. Elias was nowhere to be seen. This was a moment between the two of them. Naomi walked over and gently poured a kettle of fresh water over a tea bag in a mug, then slid the mug across the counter to Grace. It was a simple, everyday ritual, but tonight it felt like a crown. "Thank you, Grace," Naomi said, her voice husky with emotion. She didn't thank her for the food or for the professionalism. "Thank you for everything. Always." Grace looked down at the steaming tea, then up at Naomi. She saw the same frightened, grateful eyes from the hospital room years ago, but now they were stronger, more certain. "It is my privilege, Miss Naomi," Grace replied softly, her own voice thick with the depth of the memories. She took a slow sip of the tea. The quiet dignity she had maintained all evening was now transformed into pure, solid peace. She hadn't been fighting to keep a job. She had been fighting for the truth of her place in a family she had helped build from the ground up. And tonight, with Naomi's defense ringing in her ears and the warmth of the tea in her hands, Grace knew the victory was complete. Hope, justice, and the quiet, enduring love of family. That was the standard that truly mattered. And in this house, that standard would always prevail. The dining room was silent, but the quiet was electric, filled with the sheer force of Naomi Hawthorne's righteous anger. Trevor Sterling and Mrs. Caldwell had retreated, defeated, their dignity shattered by Naomi's defense of Grace and Elias's fame backing. Chloe, their daughter, had fled the room, ashamed by her parents' moral clarity. Elias walked over to Naomi, his face finally relaxing from the business tension. He took her hand, a simple, strong gesture that spoke volumes. The remaining loyal guests, a couple named the Richardsons and another, the Singhs, looked at the untouched jerk-hen, then at Naomi, their expressions a mix of awe and respect. "Naomi," Elias whispered, his voice full of pride. "That was necessary. Thank you." Naomi squeezed his hand. "It's about more than the deal, Elias. It's about who we are." She looked down the table at the few people who hadn't joined the chorus of snobbery. They had stuck by the Hawthorns, and they deserved to witness the final act of justice. "Well, friends," Naomi said, raising her voice with a sudden, sharp lightness that drew all eyes to her. "I believe there is still some dessert to be had." Mrs. Caldwell was looking forward to something reliable and French, so let's see what Grace has prepared for that standard. Just as a server was about to roll in the dessert cart, the swing doors near the entrance of the dining room burst open. Trevor Sterling stalked back in, his face tight and furious. "Naomi, I demand you retract those ridiculous accusations," he barked, striding back toward the table. "You have embarrassed me and jeopardized a 9-figure deal based on sentimentality over your kitchen staff. I will not stand for this baseless moralizing." He stopped right next to the empty space where his plate had been. Mrs. Caldwell trailed miserably behind him, a dark cloud of regret hanging over her silk dress. Naomi turned slowly to face them, her expression serene. She held up her hands in a gesture of calm. "Mr. Sterling, please. There is nothing baseless about truth. You and your friends have spent the evening passing judgment on quality you haven't even tasted. You've insulted our home, our standards, and a woman whose skill is beyond reproach." Sterling scoffed, gesturing wildly at the discarded plate. The food was clearly inappropriate for this setting. It was too ethnic. "It's what you expect from—" He stopped himself, catching Elias's dangerous glare, but the damage was done. Naomi smiled, a slow, cutting smile that held no warmth. "Too ethnic, Mr. Sterling. Too aggressive. Too rustic for your delicate palate." Naomi repeated his phrases, her voice dripping with irony. "Perhaps you should be more careful about what you choose to eat, then, and whom you choose to insult." She paused, and the entire room went silent. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "You see, Mr. Sterling," Naomi continued, her voice taking on a quiet, powerful resonance, The main course wasn't the first course Grace prepared tonight that you and your colleagues ate. Do you remember the canapes served during the reception? The tiny, complex, puff pastry tarts with the perfectly smoked salmon that you praised so loudly to Elias. Sterling frowned, uncertain. Yes, they were quite traditional. Excellent, in fact. That is what I expect from a formal caterer. Ah, but there was no caterer, Mr. Sterling, Naomi declared, her voice rising slightly. Those delicate puff pastry tarts, the ones with the subtle hint of allspice and habanero honey that you thought were so traditional and refined, those were made by Grace. Every single one, from scratch, using a specific French technique she mastered while studying in culinary school. A gasp rippled around the table from the remaining guests. The Richardsons exchanged stunned, knowing glances. Naomi's gaze moved to Mrs. Caldwell, who looked as if she'd swallowed a lemon. And Mrs. Caldwell, Naomi continued, with cold triumph. Do you recall sending back the risotto and demanding the dinner rolls, praising the buttery, subtle perfection of the white bread, stating you were sticking to the classics? Mrs. Caldwell nodded weakly, clutching her coat close to her chest. Grace baked those rolls, Mrs. Caldwell. She bakes all our bread. That was her signature brioche recipe, made with slow-proofed yeast and cultured butter. The same hands that baked that classic bread were the hands that prepared the jerkin you refused. The full, humiliating truth hit the snobs like a physical wave. They hadn't just rejected the food. They had selectively insulted a woman's skill based entirely on the cultural label they placed on it. They had eaten, enjoyed, and praised Grace's food when they believed it was white-glove sophisticated, but rejected it instantly when they thought it was the black maid's food. The table erupted. The Richardsons started laughing, a warm, genuine laughter of astonishment and pure joy. The Singhs clapped softly, their expressions full of respect for Naomi's masterful trap. Trevor Sterling's face turned a violent, blotchy red. He had nothing left to say. His hypocrisy was laid bare, exposed in the most public and undeniable way possible. He looked like a cornered animal, his entire social edifice crumbling around him. You set a trap. Sterling sputtered, his voice cracking with defeated rage. No, Mr. Sterling, Naomi corrected him calmly, walking to the head of the table. Grace set the standard. I simply removed the blindfolds. Her quality is constant, regardless of the dish. Your prejudice, however, is flexible. Sterling and Caldwell couldn't endure the shame for another second. Without a single farewell, they wheeled around and practically ran out of the dining room and out the front door, chased by the sound of honest, triumphant laughter. In the kitchen, Grace had been preparing the French-inspired dessert. Leah, the server, rushed in, her eyes shining with disbelief and pure elation. Grace, you won. Mrs. Hawthorne exposed them. The canapes, the rolls. They ate it all and praised it. They just left, screaming mad. Grace leaned against the counter, suddenly weak but overwhelmingly joyful. The full measure of justice was hers. Naomi had not only defended her dignity but had utterly crushed the snobbery that threatened it, using Grace's own skill as the weapon. Naomi and Elias soon walked into the kitchen, their faces glowing with exhausted but satisfied triumph. Elias held out his hand to Grace, shaking it firmly. Grace, Elias said simply, a sincerity in his voice that was worth more than his entire fortune. Thank you for teaching us a lesson about true standards tonight. Naomi didn't shake her hand. She did something far more profound. She stepped forward and wrapped Grace in a warm, solid hug. You are the best of us, my friend, Naomi whispered into Grace's ear. Never forget that. Grace returned the hug, feeling the profound peace of a battle fully and justly won. The humiliation was gone, replaced by the warmth of loyalty, love, and the undeniable truth that in the Hawthorne house, true quality and true character always prevailed. It was a victory not just for a maid, but for every person who has ever been judged by a label instead of their heart. The morning after the dinner, the Hawthorne mansion felt heavy, not with the smell of expensive food, but with the quiet weight of shame. Upstairs, in her enormous bedroom suite that overlooked the manicured gardens, Chloe Hawthorne was miserable. The glow of her youth and privilege had dimmed, replaced by a hollow, nauseating emptiness. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying her mother's voice, not the angry voice, but the deeply disappointed one. You risk your character by believing that status and money are the only things that matter. Chloe was accustomed to pouting, to having things fixed, to sending back clothes that didn't fit. But this feeling, this deep, churning guilt, couldn't be returned. She had publicly betrayed her mother and her father, and Weiss, she had savagely insulted Grace, the woman who had spent countless hours teaching her to count and tying her shoelaces. She looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The diamond earrings and designer dress from the night before seemed grotesque, a uniform for the exact kind of superficial person her mother had just so eloquently condemned. She realized that her greatest fear wasn't losing money. It was becoming one of those cold, small-hearted snubs who saw human worth as disposable. She had fought to be accepted by the very people her parents had just exiled. The act of humility, admitting she was wrong, was the single most difficult thing Chloe had ever faced. Her entire life had taught her that Hawthorns never apologized to staff. But she knew, in her gut, that Grace wasn't staff. She was the anchor. Around 8 o'clock, she changed into a simple sweater and jeans, leaving her hair unstyled and her face bare. She needed to look and feel as vulnerable as she truly was. She walked down the sweeping staircase, her steps hesitant, her mind practicing and discarding apologies. Every word she thought of sounded flimsy, fake, and entirely insufficient. The kitchen was the warmest, brightest room in the house. Grace was there, humming a low tune as she chopped fresh fruit for a morning smoothie. The usual scent of coffee and cinnamon was reassuring, a sign that life, despite the storm, still proceeded with quiet order. Grace looked up as Chloe walked in, and her humming stopped. The silence that followed was thick with history. 10 years of shared life suddenly condensed into this one fragile moment of judgment and repentance. Chloe leaned against the doorframe, unable to move further. Her throat felt tight, and her eyes were fixed on the clean, strong line of Grace's back. Grace, Chloe managed, the word barely a whisper. Grace turned fully, her expression completely neutral, offering no easy welcome or forgiveness. She simply waited, her posture patient and dignified. I didn't sleep at all, Chloe began, her rehearsed words instantly failing her. She pushed off the doorframe and walked closer to the counter, her voice catching. What I said last night, about you and your food and about you just being the maid. It was vile. It was wrong. Tears welled quickly in Chloe's eyes. This was real shame, not the petty embarrassment of a spoiled child. I was trying to impress Mr. Sterling and Mrs. Caldwell, and I was trying to make Mom angry, Chloe confessed, the truth pouring out like a painful relief. But it was selfish and cruel, and you deserved none of it. I know you saved Mom's life. I know you were the only reason we weren't a wreck when Dad was starting his company. You raised me, Grace. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I'm so ashamed. I'm so sorry. Grace let her cry for a moment, letting the apology be fully felt and owned. Then, she put down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked around the counter. She didn't hug her. She didn't need to. She just reached out and gently rested a hand on Chloe's arm. I heard you, Chloe, Grace said, her voice soft but unwavering, like a warm anchor. I heard every word. And words like that, they sting. They sting because they come from someone you love. Grace looked into the young woman's eyes that had once been those of a child who relied on her for comfort. But I also know who you are. You were a little girl, Chloe, and now you are a young woman who is trying to figure out which voice to listen to. The voice of people who have money but no kindness, or the voice of your own heart. Last night, you listened to the wrong voice. Grace squeezed her arm gently. Humility is hard, honey, but it is the first step toward getting things right. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for making the apology real. Chloe sniffled, meeting Grace's gaze. Does this mean, can you forgive me? Grace offered a gentle, tired smile. I forgave the child who said the words long before you came down the stairs. The woman who came down to apologize? She is a welcome sight. We all make mistakes. Chloe. The important thing is that you learn that the worth of a person is never written on a bank statement or name tag. Grace then stepped back, picking up the chopping knife again. Now, she said, her voice turning practical. I need to finish this fruit. Why don't you grab me the serving bowls from the cupboard? You haven't done that since you were tall enough to reach the bottom shelf. It was the quietest, most powerful act of reconciliation possible. Grace wasn't demanding a grand gesture. She was simply inviting Chloe back into the normal, shared rhythm of their home, treating her like the young woman she was helping to teach. Chloe wiped her eyes, a genuine smile replacing the tears. She walked over to the cupboard and pulled out the bowls. The simple task felt monumental. She was serving Grace, not the other way around. As she worked, Chloe felt the crushing weight lift, replaced by a gentle warmth. She knew the path to rebuilding their relationship would be long, but she had taken the first step toward becoming the woman her mother believed she could be, and the woman Grace had helped raise. Love and forgiveness, she realized, were far more valuable than any standard of sophistication. And in the heart of the Hawthorne home, where justice and loyalty had won the day, Grace's enduring kindness was the final, most beautiful victory of all. A few days after the grand, disastrous dinner, a profound sense of peace had settled over the Hawthorne household. The massive, shining kitchen wasn't just a workspace. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where genuine character had won a war against snobbery. Grace was preparing a simple, quiet lunch. The air still held the scent of cinnamon and the calm order she brought to everything. She had felt the healing ripple through the house. Chloe was now quiet and respectful, and both Elias and Naomi were warmer, their gratitude palpable in every interaction. Suddenly, Naomi appeared, dressed simply but elegantly. Grace, could you come into the sitting room for a moment, please? Elias has something he needs to discuss with you. Grace wiped her hands on her apron, her mind immediately running through menus. She followed Naomi into the main living room, a vast, beautiful space rarely used for anything less than a formal event. But this was no formal event. It was a family moment. Elias was standing by the fireplace, looking serious but kind. Chloe was there, sitting quietly on a sofa next to her younger brother, Leo, both looking expectantly at Grace. The billionaire and his family stood united, not as employers and staff, but as people ready to acknowledge a deep, fundamental truth. Grace, please sit, Elias said, gesturing toward a soft armchair. Grace sat, her quiet dignity present even in her confusion. Elias cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice wasn't the hard, business tone he used for boardrooms. It was soft and deeply sincere. Grace, what happened the other night? It taught us a profound lesson. You showed all of us, myself included, that true quality and true value are not found in bank accounts or social status. They are found in integrity, loyalty, and heart. He walked a step closer, his eyes fixed on hers. We want to make something very clear, publicly, in front of our children. Your service to this family has never been merely professional. It has been foundational. You saved this family when we were too busy, too young, or too sick to save ourselves. Naomi took the cue, stepping up beside him. You didn't just cook for us, Grace. You raised our children. You nursed me back to health. You have been the heart, the soul, and the backbone of this house for 10 years. You are family, Grace. You just are. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box, but it wasn't a piece of expensive jewelry. Inside was a simple, gleaming silver key. Grace, Elias said, his voice husky with emotion. This is the key to our cottage up north. It's yours to use whenever you need peace, whenever you want a break. But more importantly, it is a symbol. It is a symbol that you are no longer defined by a job title in this home. Your position here is permanent, respected, and non-negotiable. You are not just a maid. You are the Hawthorne family anchor. Grace stared at the key, her eyes welling up. She had maintained her composure through insults and crises, but this quiet, sincere honor, this acknowledgement of her worth, broke through her professional defenses. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Mr. Elias, Miss Naomi," she whispered, her voice thick. I only did my job." Naomi shook her head firmly. "No, you did more than that. You loved us." Then, Chloe stood up. This was the moment Grace truly felt the final reconciliation. Chloe walked slowly to Grace's chair. She didn't speak the apology she'd given the day before. She spoke a new truth. "Grace," Chloe said, her voice shaking slightly, but steady with sincerity. "When the guests walked out, I was embarrassed. When Mom told them off, I was confused. But when I saw you standing so tall, and when I realized I was siding with people who didn't know the difference between a good person and a snob, that's when I finally understood." Chloe's eyes met Grace's, full of honest regret and newfound respect. "You taught me what standards really mean. They mean being kind and being true. I want to be better, and I know the only way to do that is to see you not as staff, but as the incredible woman you are." Chloe reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around Grace. It wasn't the formal hug of a child. It was the honest, humble embrace of a young woman accepting a moral lesson from her true mentor. Grace held the girl who was like a daughter to her, a wave of pure, absolute warmth washing over her heart. The younger brother, Leo, sensing the gravity and love of the moment, ran over and hugged them both, completing the circle. Elias and Naomi looked on, their eyes shining with relief and pride. The family unit, momentarily shaken by arrogance, was now stronger than ever, rebuilt on the foundation of respect. Grace, holding her family close, knew she had won everything that mattered. She hadn't sought fame or wealth. She had simply lived with dignity, poured her heart into her work, and loved those in her care. And in the end, her quiet, enduring goodness was publicly honored and acknowledged as the most valuable asset in the entire Hawthorne fortune. Hope, justice, and the deep, abiding love of family had achieved the perfect, final victory. A few weeks had passed since the dramatic dinner, and the air in the Hawthorne mansion felt different. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled joy. The house felt less like a museum for billionaires and more like a warm, bustling home. Chloe, the daughter, was spending her mornings not at the high-end boutiques, but in the kitchen. She was learning to bake bread, Grace's signature brioche, the very dish that had helped bring down the arrogant guests. Grace was a patient teacher, and the shared work was the quiet foundation of their new, respectful bond. The scent of yeast and fresh flour was now as much a part of the house as the expensive cologne had once been. Tonight, Elias and Naomi were hosting another dinner, but this one was deliberately small, intimate, and entirely different. There was no pressure for business deals. The only currency accepted at this table was sincerity. The guests were the Richardsons and the Singhs, the two couples who had quietly refused to participate in the snobbery during the last meal. Joining them were a handful of other trusted friends, people Elias and Naomi admired for their character, not their net worth. An honest doctor, a successful but humble university professor, and a local artist. Grace was still the culinary heart of the evening, but tonight she was also a central guest. Naomi had insisted. She wore a simple, beautiful deep red dress that Elias had quietly bought for her. And though she was ready to help with service, she was encouraged to simply enjoy the warmth of the gathering. The atmosphere was relaxed, full of genuine laughter and easy, real conversation. The food was a magnificent celebration of Grace's skill, her heritage and classical cuisine blended seamlessly. Everyone ate with delight, praising the flavor and the heart behind the meal, never asking about the origins. Near the end of the evening, as coffee was being poured and the gentle clinking of dessert spoons filled the air, Naomi Hawthorne stood up. Elias and both children, Chloe and young Leo, rose with her. The room instantly quieted, ready for the final, most meaningful toast. Naomi held a crystal glass of port wine, her sapphire blue eyes shining with genuine happiness. She glanced briefly at Elias, who gave her a nod of complete love and support, and then her eyes rested on Grace, who was sitting near the end of the long table, her red dress radiating warmth. "Friends," Naomi began, her voice clear and strong, echoing the moral clarity she had found. I didn't ask you here tonight to discuss investments, or stocks, or any of the things that used to define the purpose of this table. I asked you here tonight to celebrate something far more valuable. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. A few weeks ago, this house hosted a dinner that became a turning point for my family. It taught us that wealth can sometimes blind people to true quality and true dignity. It taught us that the only real standard that matters is the standard of the heart. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping over the loyal guests, full of gratitude for their quiet integrity. That night, she continued, her voice growing tender, some people chose to look down on a meal prepared with love, simply because of a label they tried to place on the woman who cooked it. They chose snobbery over sincerity. They chose prejudice over skill. The Richardsons nodded solemnly, remembering the tension. But tonight, Naomi said, her voice lifting in triumphant joy, we are setting a new tradition. Tonight, we raise our glasses to the woman who showed us what real value looks like. We raise our glasses to Grace. Grace's hands, resting on the tablecloth, began to tremble. Her dignity had been honored before, but never so beautifully, never so publicly, and never so completely acknowledged as the source of the family's greatest lesson. Naomi looked directly at Grace, her smile full of deep, sisterly affection. Grace, you are the most loyal, talented, and dignified person I have ever known. You are the architect of our home's happiness. You are not just our foundation. You are our family anchor. Thank you for teaching us that integrity is always worth more than $1 billion deal. Elias, standing beside his wife, lifted his glass high, his voice booming with pride. To Grace, to the truth. The entire table, the Richardsons, the Singhs, the doctor, the professor, all rose instantly, lifting their glasses in a joyous chorus. To Grace, they cheered. To true respect. Grace stood, her eyes shining with tears that were now purely joyful. The love in the room was so thick, so palpable, it felt like a soft blanket wrapped around her. As the cheers subsided, Chloe walked quickly around the table. She reached Grace and gave her a long, genuine hug. Not the hug of a child, but the embrace of a redeemed young woman. To forgiveness, Grace, Chloe whispered into her ear. And to your courage. I'll see you in the kitchen tomorrow. Grace watched as Chloe walked back, a profound, quiet peace settling over her. She knew that the true victory wasn't the billionaire's contract or the humiliation of the snobs. It was the warmth of that hug and the sincere toast that confirmed her true, untouchable place in the world. Her heart was full. Hope and love had prevailed completely, and the Hawthorne home, finally anchored by true respect, would be strong forever. If this story touched your heart, type the name of your city in the comments. Like this video, and make sure you subscribe for more heartwarming stories just like this. Until next time, stay inspired.